everyone remember what you're saying.
Surprise. Okay, everybody stop now.
There's a joke in the UK where a long time ago that there was a show that this guy said he was mirroring Big Brother. And he says on the real Big Brother they said please don't swear. So this guy did this other show which took the mickey out of Big Brother. He says you're live, don't say fuck or bugger. So yeah.
Oh, now you're gonna have to cut that out.
Now we're live. So, how's everybody's week going?
Good.
Yeah. Is it Olga or Olga? I just want to make sure that folks know exactly what your name is.
It depends on where you are. In America, everybody calls me Olga because a lot of people can't say the soft L. My family and my Russian friends call me Oля or Olga if you wanted to use my full name. So whatever you're comfortable with, just as long as it's some variation of my name.
Yeah, I've been called everything under the sun, so it's like at this point I don't mind people mispronouncing my name. But I just want to make sure that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But you did have that JetBrains webinar this week, which I watched. I thought it was really good. What was your feelings going kind of through your webinar?
I mean, I tend to overthink all of the things after I do any sort of speaking engagement, so I might have a little bit of a different opinion than some other folks. But the feedback was really good, so I'm happy about that, and I'm happy that people found it useful. And that was like the most important piece is if that people are actually using this thing or like using the information that I'm giving them.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, watching the webinar, I was thinking about larger teams where, like, there's product teams and services teams that, in a sense, you might have people transitioning between those teams working on different products and kind of having that set foundation of .NET templates, I think would be really beneficial as companies and teams start to grow their footprint.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially if you're going the microservices route, and you want to make sure that your developers might not be well versed with how your infrastructure behaves or how something else, like they don't necessarily always have the skills to see something from the beginning to end. I mean, they could probably learn it fairly quickly. We work with a lot of smart people, but every organization has a different tech stack. Every organization has like a different way of doing things. So this at least helps people cut that piece out so they can go straight into writing their business logic. And then after the fact, if they need to change something or if they want to learn about it, they can always go back and do that.
The thing to remember with that is when people get a bit excited writing .NET templates, and therefore, I'm not saying I've been somewhere, but I have, and they wrote a .NET template, and it, .NET new web app, for example, and it brought in absolutely everything you could think of. So whilst it was, hey guys, I've written this thing for the company that we can all, get started writing our microservice. When you looked at the dependency graph, there was not much micro about it. So you've got to keep an eye on whoever's writing these templates.
For sure. And the nice thing about the templates themselves is you can make them as modular as you need to. So if you're using specific packages, but you only need them in specific scenarios, you can also exclude them with the template, so you don't have to bring in that specific piece. But it also depends on how granular you want your template. But I can definitely see that getting out of hand. I mean, I get excited because I'm like, oh, I get to write more stuff, because I don't actually get to write as much code as I want to these days. But being able to account for different scenarios, and I don't know. I can see people getting a little overzealous in that case.
Yeah, I think Jonathan was just alluding to his F# superiority now. So no matter what you write in C#, it's just It's just not going to be as good as it.
Just trying to keep you honest. That's all.
That's very noticeable. Yeah.
A lot of people are really passionate about F sharp these days. Like when I talk to people who are getting into F sharp, they're like, "Let me tell you about F sharp and how awesome it is." There's nothing wrong with that.
I just like trolling him. That's all.
Yeah, the Jonathan, just like any tweet I send out, even if it's not about programming, he's like, F sharp can do that. It's like, dude, I'm just talking about my dinner. What are you talking about?
What's funny, Khalid, because you said it, I was probably more nervous than with any of the talks that I did before when I had to announce Olga. I was asking before, what should I say? And when I was actually saying it, it was like completely different to what I committed. And like, oh my God, it's like 2 minutes what you're talking and you can't even deliver that in the way it was planned. Never mind.
I mean, that was my entire presentation, so it's all good.
I think maybe people who do public speaking are probably a little too hard on themselves, and they probably start thinking about all the ums and ahs and, oh, I wish I would have said that. It's like,
yeah, but come on, I was asking, how would you like to be introduced? And I fuck up about that.
Seemed fine to me.
Like you asked the question and did it the other way.
What did you say?
You asked how to do it and then went on and did it the other way.
Yeah, true. Oh man.
So I mean, I've been ribbing Jonathan a little bit on his F sharp newfound religion, but I mean, how has it been over the last several months, kind of transitioning from C sharp to F sharp? Like, what kind of advice would you give yourself 3 months ago? From 3 months ago,
don't do
it. I'm hoping your employer and colleagues are not watching this.
No, only joking. I mean, what I tried to. I didn't have long to kind of get stuck in before I started the new job. So what I tried to do was, again, I think with most things when you're learning something, it's try and just write something in that language or using that tool. I did some quite good work actually that I used today, in fact, which there was a repo by Demis who runs Service Stack, and he had some C sharp, I think 100 C sharp link examples, and he then had a Kotlin one, which was the same thing. I think he had a few other languages, and I thought, well, I'll take those as an example and write them in F sharp, just for me to, how would I find the first item in an array? How would I find the last one? How would I, what's the equivalent of C sharp select in a link statement in F sharp? Obviously, you can use link in F sharp, but they also have their own collections and keywords. So how would you do that? How would you, do projections and things like that? So I found that quite useful. And as I said, I used something today that I knew I'd done using those examples, so I could go back to that. I guess with anything, it's just getting involved with the project. Obviously, writing a few simple apps at home on your own is one thing, but then you're working in a team with a project that's been written in F sharp for 12 months, 18 months. It's a bit different. So it's just exposure, isn't it? I think with anything, really.
Yeah, I think the big question for me has always been like wanting to see a production F sharp application. And just because like every F sharp example that I see kind of has this demo purism, right?
Yes.
Like,
but I think that you could argue that with C sharp, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's easy to kind of set up the pins so you can knock them down in a sense.
Especially with your tweets.
But for me, it's like, I'm just curious to see, we all want everything to be perfect, but obviously once code starts to get into production, bugs and kind of inefficiencies and maybe things you didn't want to do, but somehow find yourself needing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent the last week, this week, with a colleague of mine refactoring a whole bunch of production code. A, because something doesn't work, and B, because I don't really understand what the hell's going on. And so actually spending the week with him to kind of rip all this stuff out, well, not rip it out, but refactor it, gets me to understand, that's what it means. You know, we had lots of architectural diagrams which were good for me to join as a new team member, which highlighted the architecture. But then when things about the code base are getting discussed, you kind of go, okay, I kind of understand it, but why is that going out and then coming back in again? And I didn't understand it. But this week has been good because I've been right in the guts of the core of our business logic, essentially, and getting to learn it and understand it. So that's good. I mean, the other thing I am working on, it was going to be a C# app, but I've decided to do a bit more of a exploration into event storming and things like that, and looking at Event Store and SQL Stream Store and Martin. At the moment, I'm playing with Martin, which has proved to be a nice, simple API to kind of get, event sourcing going. And I was originally going to do that in C#, but I think I might do that in F#. Primarily for me to kind of keep learning F#, but also the reason I did it was an example of how to do event storming, how to do, I'm not going to say REST, but a decent HTTP API, with caching, clients, CQRS and all that kind of stuff. So I'm hoping one day that might see the light of day, and you can maybe use that as an example to see how some sort of F# can be written. I'm sure it'll get slated, but
yeah, I know this is kind of a good segue to what Alexey's blog post was this week, which is the difference between like fakes and stubs. Do you find testing F# and like writing those kind of unit tests and testing against maybe databases and stuff easier? And I'd like Alexey to kind of jump in and maybe explain what his blog post was about as well.
Yeah, well, the blog post was more, I guess, agnostic of the language. It's more of the approaches, because whenever, it doesn't really matter what language you're doing, like what kind of architecture you're building, you're always going to end up with situations where there are some dependencies that you're just not going to be able to run in tests. And for instance, in functional languages, you would inject different functions, and that would essentially replace mocks. But in object-oriented, we have this different approaches with like frameworks that generate dynamic substitutes and whatever. And the main idea, I guess, behind the article was that, first of all, it made this observation that a lot of people just in object-oriented world, at least, go for mocks as the default choice, because the mocking frameworks provide like an easy way to create stuff, and you have to think about the problems later usually. But there are also alternative ways, and one of them is to create substitutes by hand, and this is like what I call fake. And again, like those definitions, they're very volatile, because I try to always start the article by defining what exactly those words mean in this context, because I went on to, for instance, to Wikipedia to check what they think about it, and then it just basically gave up, because the definitions are so inconsistent. It's just I don't know what to do about it, but if it's this thing, then it's that thing, and for stuff like this. But anyway, and I think this preference towards mocks in object-oriented world in testing is a little bit, I guess there is more preference than it's supposed to be, because in many ways fakes are much more efficient at providing good test confidence, because they allow you to build a fully complete functionality that makes sense together, even though it's not usable in production, but it's otherwise fully functional, complete. And that saves you from a lot of different problems, including building implementation-aware tests and all kind of stuff. But even then, sometimes you would still use mocks, but I just think that as a basis, like you should probably consider other options more often than most people do.
Yeah,
I have a short question, if I may. Just to summarize, maybe. I mean, I remember quite some time ago, I also read the distinction between mocks and fakes, and they are also dummies, right? So speaking in a more practical way, you would say fakes is something that you implement manually via subtyping. And a mock is something using, I don't know, and substitute, fake it easy, or mock you.
It's a bit different. I mean, first of all, like, so there are different types of substitutes. There's mocks, fakes, but also like stubs and dummies. I don't differentiate between stubs and dummies. I kind of just glove them together with mocks because most people really don't make distinctions between them anyway. And for mocks, it's basically, it doesn't have to be objects created like with those frameworks or dynamically, but those are just objects that have predefined responses. Like you won't be able to use one mock from like one test and, in some other tests most of the time because it's very tightly coupled to the scenario that it was programmed for.
Okay.
And fakes, they can theoretically also be generated with mocking frameworks, but it's usually just, there's no point in it. And the special thing about it is that they have a complete implementation. For instance, like if you take it out and replace the real service with it, most likely everything will still work. It just won't make sense in production because, for instance, you're using a memory database instead of a real one. But otherwise, it's a full replacement. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess the question I have for you, Alexey, I don't know exactly where you're working right now, team size or whatever. Jonathan is probably working in a business unit, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I got from your article was like, instead of building these fakes specifically for the test, you build these fakes as if they were self-contained and services on themselves, and they should try to mimic the behavior of the thing that you're testing against.
Yeah, that's great.
But the big question that I have is like, if you take on a dependency that is complex enough, when is there like a diminishing return on spending that much time trying to build something that behaves like, SQL Server or PostgreSQL? Like, how do you make that distinction of I should build this thing or just do an integration test, right? I guess that's where I'm going.
Well, like for instance, with SQL Server, if you have the option to have the engine run in memory somehow, for instance, like with EF Core, you can use SQLite in memory or something like this. This is not like a full replacement, but if in your scenario it's good enough, then it should be your first choice because it's provided, it's already tested. And you're right that like if you have very difficult or complex dependencies, writing fakes rather can be a pretty time-consuming business. But then it can be argued that if the dependency is complex enough in the first place, then it's not the problem that it is with mocks that you have to spend so much effort, but that you have to actually test all of those different corner cases and behaviors. And so maybe that by having to think about it, it actually comes into your perspective that you have to do that. Whilst
the lines are getting blurred, aren't they, these days, between integration tests, unit tests, fakes, mocks, especially with things like Docker, because I know the last two places I've worked at is on a C# code base, and actually, I introduced it here as well, is for database tests, you can spin up a Docker container as part of an XUnit collection, which you can then share, or you can share the database per test suite, kill the database schema for a certain set of tests and bring them back up on another set. And therefore your complex dependency is now, the only thing you're waiting for really is Docker to spin up an image for your tests, which on modern hardware is relatively quick. So actually, whilst you can argue about tests, fakes and mocks and stuff, actually, if you can make use of what XUnit offers. For example, you can then spin up your actual dependency as part of your test, and you've got an integration test as well as a unit test maybe. But I would argue your unit is possibly not hitting the database most of the time, but it makes it, I think using Docker makes integration tests a lot easier.
That's for sure. I would actually, sorry for interrupting.
No, go ahead, Alexey.
Yeah, it's actually like if there's different steps you go through. Like first of all, if you can test everything using, for instance, Docker or whatever, and use real dependencies and stuff like this with the minimum degradation, like your tests are still stable, it runs fast, then you absolutely should do it. So the article was more talking about the case where you can't. And otherwise, I completely agree with you. If you can, like with databases, it's usually not even a problem. You just run them in Docker, and it's mostly good enough.
I mean, an interesting project that we used at my last place was a thing called Local Stack. So people are using, if people are shipping to AWS and they're, using Lambdas and SNS and SQS and things like that, it allows you effectively to run AWS in Docker. So therefore, it's not exactly the same infrastructure as what you're going to deploy on, but their aim is to make it as close as possible. So again, that's using Docker, another good example of how you can almost kind of run your whole project against AWS on your own machine. I mean, it's not perfect, and but it worked for what we needed, and it did a good job. And I actually wish that other cloud providers would provide something like that, because where I am at the moment, we're using GCP, and it would be handy to have something like that. Whereas at the moment, we've written our own, kind of message bus for tests and subscriptions and publishers, just so our tests kind of mimic what a pub sub's going to look like. So
I know when I use Azure, I use Azurite, which is like cross-platform Azure emulator. I think Martin, our JetBrains colleague, just integrated it into JetBrains Writer, into the Azure Toolkit. So when you pull the Azure Toolkit extension down for Writer, you just get Azurite right out of the box. So you don't have to do anything kind of wacky.
Probably, I don't know, 18 months ago, I was doing something with Azure table storage, maybe. And I think there was an emulator. Again, I'm not sure whether that was from Microsoft or just an open source project, but its claim to fame was that this was a cross-platform, thing, and just didn't work. So
yeah, I had the same experience at some point.
It did not work. You're saying?
No, it did for Windows users, but most of our team were on Macs or Linux. So
yeah, I've had success with Azurite. I mean, I think it works pretty well now. I think the big problem with Azure, I don't know if it's a bad problem, but it is a problem. It's just the iteration happens so fast. So you go from like brand new like service vertical in Azure, and then it's the hype, and then it becomes classic, and then it like gets deprecated. Maybe I've gone through enough of those cycles that I feel like it happens, but maybe it just doesn't happen that often now. But
well, from the perspective of technology, I mean, they evolve so quickly, or what do you mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think
like outdated already next week or something.
Yeah, I think Azure Table Storage, parts of it were being deprecated in favor of Cosmos DB, but they're similar technologies, but they're not the same exact technology. So I know a lot of people appreciated Table Storage's pricing model, whereas Cosmos DB seemed like it could really bite you in terms of cost, right? I think the Azure team has done a little bit to reduce that, but I think it's still a lot higher than, say, Azure Table Storage. But I could be wrong. I haven't looked at it in a while, but no, I think it's interesting, right? Because when we talk about testing stuff, we're really talking about confidence, like a probability of confidence. We're not talking about absolute certainty. And I think as developers, we're constantly trying to balance whether we have confidence in terms of deploying something. But I think we've probably all been around long enough to understand that once you push something to production, there's going to be 1,000 things you just didn't think about. And that could potentially crop up as a problem. So no matter how good you unit test or integration test your applications, it's really hard to create a production environment on a dev machine and to create production like load on your application to kind of find those weird edge cases, right?
I guess it's where the boundary finishes or starts on your perspective. Years ago we would have written, we might have used fakes, or we would have used our own in-memory things. Now with things like Docker, you can almost push that a bit further and say, well, we can now hit the database on our system and it seems to work. And then you can kind of argue, well, what about kind of like blue-green deployments? So I know it's not your test. It's not part of your test plan, but you could argue that you've done all these tests with unit tests, integration tests, and now you could argue that a blue-green deployment could be part of your test plan because, all right, we've done everything we can. We've now shipped it or deployed it as part of a blue-green deployment. Does that work? Yes or no? If it doesn't, then make the switch and fix what's broken. I guess.
I think from my perspective, sorry. Yeah. From my perspective, like it's true. Like for me, it started to thinking what you were asking about diminishing returns. Like at what point does it seem like it's just easier to put it in production and see if it works rather than try to test it? But I think from my perspective, the important part, like if you're working in a business or something and your PM comes in and asks, well, that feature that you've dragged on Jira table from like to do to done, is it actually working now or not? And most of the time, like if you're able to say, yes, it does. I have written tests, they complete. I'm sure it works. If it doesn't, then it's something completely unexpected. If this kind of confidence exists, then it's already fine. But most of the times, okay, maybe not most of the times, but sometimes I would observe from my colleagues, they would say, oh, well, I guess maybe it does. They've run it manually a few times, but then I wrote unit tests, they pass, but I don't know. Like you have to try it on production. I have no idea if it actually works there. This is not enough confidence. And it really comes down to like, how are you surprised if something doesn't actually end up working after you've thought it would? There was like a really cool tweet just, I think a few days ago, like imagine you make like a huge refactor of your system and all your tests pass. What is your reaction? Do you think that your tests are broken, or are you happy that you've actually refactored everything correctly?
I mean, I would think everything's broken because
the only testing you do is in production, right?
Well, I guess to me, the interesting thing about code is like, even when you write it and it's new, it has like a shelf life. It like any code that you write, and I think this question came up for Olga during her webinar, but like everything around you is constantly changing, right? Like the cloud providers constantly updating their servers and patching things. .NET
packages, .NET, NuGet packages, .NET.
Yeah, like everything is changing. So in a sense, it's like even if you don't touch your code, there's a timer going in terms of when you have to react to it, and it's eroding the second you deploy it. Olga's .NET template talk, someone asked, what do you do about that erosion factor, especially with templates, right? Because you write a template today, somebody creates a project, but dependencies and the projects themselves, they're snapshot in time, right? So what do you do in those instances?
Dependabot.
Yeah. Yeah, bots are going to change it all.
Just use Just use F#.
But it's also interesting over time how this perception changed for me as well. When I started my first job, I think we tested that framework. I mean, it was a proper framework, which was open source, and we basically tested implementation. Something that was later discussed in the test-induced damage with who was that? Martin Fowler and Kent Beck and DHH. Yeah, I don't know his proper name. Anyway,
David Heinemeier Hansen or something.
Yeah, I don't write Rails, but okay. Yeah, but that changed over time, really. And nowadays, I think that is one thing that I took from the X-Unit test patterns book, which is really cool, is the term or the idea of a safety net. Khalid, you used a different word, but basically the same idea. And probably in a bigger team, it's you have to have a common notion of that or a common idea how to approach that. But I move forward with that pretty good, I think. I mean, I decide at what point I need to write tests. It's a feeling you build up over time, probably also. Sometimes I'm getting surprised by reality, by production, of course. But I think in terms of the often so much discussed idea of code coverage, I would rate pretty badly, I think. But still, from point of the architecture, I mean, I very rarely have issues if I decide I need to test something now, and it's worth now to write tests for this specific component. I think the mindset of starting with testing or TDD even in particular, or BDD even, that's really important. But over time, you can kind of loosen the leash a little, if you know what I mean.
Go careful, you're going to have all the TDD zealots coming after you.
Yeah, I don't care. By the way, F# also has its own ideas, or at least I heard about these testing techniques the first time in the F# context, like property-based testing, right? With this FS check, I think.
Yeah,
do you have any touching points with that?
No, I've not done much with property testing, I must say.
Okay.
I've done it like once.
You know,
yeah, I've done it like once. It's a really interesting concept, and actually, like it really comes back to what you were saying earlier. I wanted to comment first, but I decided to let you finish for once. And you were saying that you're essentially often ending up just reiterating your implementation in two places. And for most people, like because you end up writing implementation twice, once your real implementation and second time what it's supposed to look like in tests, for most people, because those are different, it's actually a worthwhile exercise because it's harder to make a mistake in two places twice, right? Or at least the same mistake. And because of that, it helps catch problems if you write the test first and then you put the implementation in, you essentially do it twice. It's harder to make a mistake. But as you move forward and your system evolves, it loses its appeal because it really prevents you from evolving. Because instead of being a safety net that could help you say when there is a bug in your code, it will just say that, oh, you changed the implementation, and whether that causes a bug or it doesn't is actually a different question, which it doesn't answer. So you have to find out yourself.
It's the exact opposite what you said before, right? If you do a huge refactoring and nothing breaks, then or you do a refactoring, a minor one, and all the tests break.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you don't want anything to break when you're refactoring. The question is, if that happens, are you like, does that surprise you or not? Because like if it surprises you, it's probably because you've written tests that are dependent on implementation. They're supposed to break, but they didn't. And if you're not surprised, it means that everything went well. So it really just comes down to how, like, to you, based on your reaction, you can tell like what kind of type of testing do you prefer, I guess. It's like a psychological test for programmers.
It's always fun when you've got no tests.
The test for your test.
Actually, it's funny because what I said about testing your tests, and I had like this entire paragraph in my article that says testing the test doubles. And you know how nobody actually reads the article, so people comment without reading. And so like
controversy.
At least like 5 or 6 comments were like, "Oh, are you going to test your fakes?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I wrote about it in the article."
No, it's an interesting dilemma, right? Like, to me, working in a production application, tests are important, but I found the ability to react and have a quick feedback deployment loop was way more important than trying to get it right every time. Does that make sense? So It's like, we're all human. We're gonna make mistakes. It's just how fast can you fix those mistakes and get them out into production, right? What's that?
Just time to recover.
Yeah, I think those kind of metrics are probably more important for a lot of teams than things like code coverage and how many unit tests you have. Just kind of the workflow from development to production. I think a lot of teams should focus more on that kind of feedback loop. If I was giving advice, but obviously context and situations matter. If you're shooting a satellite into space, into deep space, you probably don't have a lot of options to update that source code. So.
It does always kind of go through my mind that when you hear of like the Falcon rockets going off and all this kind of stuff, and you think the engineering that must have gone into this is just amazing, and what how they're doing any testing or how they're doing development is astonishing. And then you kind of watch a video on one side of your screen of this rocket going to space, and then you got Twitter on the other side of your monitor, and everyone's arguing about fakes and stubs and stuff like that, and you're like,
there's use const or lat in JavaScript.
It takes me 20 deployments to center a div. It's like,
yeah, exactly.
I heard F# also has a fake framework.
Does it? I've not used it.
No, seriously, the author. Yeah, exactly. I still find it funny because Stefan, the maintainer, he was giving a talk when I was living in Vienna, and I wasn't very attentive. I mean, I apologize for that, but afterwards I still was. I was so convinced this talk was about mocking frameworks and all that stuff. And my colleagues looked at me and like, what did you do the last hour or something? Yeah.
Also, like your discussion about satellites reminded me when I worked in the medical field, and we had this, like, there was this regulation basically related to different products in your, or projects in your company or in our company based off of how likely they are to kill the patient. So basically, in theory, everything you write can end up hurting the patient, right? Because like at some point, it's gonna be interacting with the software that runs like on a scanner or something like this. So there was like a scale on like the probabilistic scale of how likely it is that you're able to, make harm or cause harm to the patient if you make a mistake. And it was kind of funny because like it was so deep in the company's culture by this point that I remember when our project moved down from that scale, and our PM went into the meeting smiling really happily and said that, "Oh, we're not able to kill the patients anymore, so we can like remove some of the tests. It's so nice."
Hold my beer.
Yeah, it was completely normal back then, but now I look back at it, it's kind of funny, I guess, maybe to me.
I mean, if you're old enough, you remember that you wrote tests that you didn't write tests. And you deployed, twice a year on premise, and just hope that everything worked. I mean, I don't remember that. I'm only 21.
Now people call that canary testing instead.
I wonder how that reflects in like other application fields, like autonomous driving, for instance, because you can basically do the same amount of harm. One time I heard that they have like a set of, I mean if you're implementing assistance systems like that, then you usually have a very large set of test data, like ridiculously high, like a few million kilometers that the software has to pass without any issues and without, I don't know, losing or getting off the track and stuff like that. But it's an interesting field if you can accidentally harm someone, right?
Well, it goes back to Khalid's point, isn't it? It's all about confidence. It's like how confident can you be, and the only true test is you release it and see what happens. So
I think the first
medical stuff, it's quite scary if that goes horribly wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, just to clarify, everyone can be confident. It's got to be at least grounded in reality. You can't have blind confidence. I've met those people. Yeah.
When we discussed robotics in one of my courses, I think the first topic that we discussed was how do you say that in English? Responsibility, like in terms of heuristical responsibility. That was the first one. So that's why at first we also discussed like medical robots, which are still controlled from an actual human. But at the same time, you could ask that question: what if he pinches 1 millimeter too far, or pinches correctly, and the robot does like a crazy move or something? Is he responsible, right? I mean,
did they teach
not
you
so
about
easy.
The Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics? Is that what you're referring to?
It rings a little bell, yeah. Can you write that in comments, maybe? I mean, the name.
And I can post a Wikipedia article because in comments, not in private chat.
Isn't there a whole film about this called iRobot and the 3 laws?
There was, yeah. That was something that he wrote as well. But
there's a bunch of Will Smith movies that I've never seen the whole way through. I don't think I've seen Wild Wild West.
I don't think I've forgiven for that.
Yeah, iRobot. What's another Will Smith movie I haven't seen? I haven't seen Bad Boys 2 yet.
I'm Legend.
You haven't seen Bad Boys?
Bad Boys for Life.
Independence Day. we should go around now.
I haven't seen Men in Black 3. I've seen Hot Fuzz. Yeah, I've seen.
So there's a quote in there where he says, "You ain't seen Bad Boys 2?"
I don't know.
Have you seen I Am Legend?
Yeah, it's disappointing for sure.
What?
I thought it was quite good.
Yeah, the ending was pretty terrible.
It's terrible, but the film was great.
Spoilers. No spoilers. I don't want to ruin it for anybody who's yet to see I Am Legend from 10 years ago. So serious note, I've been kind of publishing these C#8, C#9 tweets that Jonathan keeps telling me F# has had for decades, I guess. I don't know. But I mean,
don't let him bully you.
Yeah, that's fine.
He loves it.
But are there features you folks are kind of looking forward to? Are there features in C# that maybe you're hesitant about? I know Olga has to kind of push out these templates and set up, language versions and stuff like that. Have you looked at the C# spec? Do you feel like there's foot guns in there that developers could shoot their foot off with? I don't know what people's thoughts are. So go.
Yes. to all questions. There are features that I'm looking forward to. It's not surprising it's gonna be records. I think that's the only thing that I really remember that I'm actually gonna, like, once C#9 lands, I'm gonna try to rewrite a bunch of stuff to use records. But on the other hand, I'm also worried of how it's implemented, or I guess how it can be used. Same with like init-only properties. It's not really clear to me whether it's compiled to actually mutable stuff, or like somebody who's using an older version of C# would use my library and break everything, that kind of stuff, like they did with nullable reference types. So on one hand, I'm excited for those, but I'm worried how those features will actually work and whether they'll be as useful as they think they could be.
Didn't Khalid do some sort of JSON tests with all the record types and how it behaves weirdly in certain scenarios? And
yeah, so what's interesting about record types is when you declare that like shorthand where the constructor is right beside the class name or the record name. Record name. But those are actually converted into fields, not properties. So in a sense, it's like if your mental model is moving from classes to records, you have to keep in mind that when you declare it that way, they're actually fields. Additionally, when you put attributes on those constructor parameters, those attributes are actually applied to the constructor parameter and not transferred over into the field, right? So if you're thinking these things will be moved around to the right places, let's say you're doing something like MVC where you're attributing a bunch of stuff. I know you're not, but all right, man, just let me finish. I'm just saying.
I've got a troll for everything.
But basically, .NET's not doing anything magical moving those things around. So like, I think that's gonna bite a lot of people as they kind of try to transition their view models and their request response objects over to records. They're gonna find those like weird quirks, I think.
Yeah.
If I had to guess.
You know what really pisses me off in C# is that even with like init-only properties, let's imagine you have some DTO that you want to instantiate. And right now, like in C#8, you can just, you're up to, like, there's no like guarantees, right? So you instantiate a type and you set the properties, and then after a while you add a new property and everything still compiles because there's not like nothing requiring you to set a property like when you initialize an object, unless you use a constructor, but then you won't be able to use it with some frameworks or whatever. And like, for instance, with TypeScript, what you can do is you can have an interface and you have this, for instance, you can have read-only, you can force like the type of the field to have a non-nullable or non-undefined type, and then whenever you instantiate that object, you'll actually have to set it. And it doesn't even have to be mutable or it has to be a record. It's just like a very, to me, seems like a very simple thing. But like even this #9 init-only properties still don't guarantee that. You will have like potentially like a non-nullable string type somewhere, but then nothing actually forces you to initialize it with some value, if I understand correctly, at least.
Yeah, I think that's the thing I found today. So I was spiking something for an open source project, and I was creating this kind of overloaded constructor with optional parameters. And then I realized like the transition to C#9 will be nice when we have init-only properties, because I think you're going to see people moving away from creating specialized constructors and basically making everything init-only properties, right? To maintain that immutability, but also give people flexibility in creating those objects. But like, you're right, Alexey, that in a sense, nothing forces you to say you have to initialize these properties. So I'm curious to see what kind of programming paradigms come out of this as we move into C#9, but it's too hard right now to tell which ones are going to be winners and which ones are going to be kind of stinker features that nobody actually uses. So,
but what do you think C#15 is going to look like?
Do you want me to say
Like
what I
Kotlin.
think I'm going to say?
Like Kotlin.
It could look like Kotlin for sure.
It'll write itself.
It'll write itself. Yeah, I'm hoping. Imagine we just got paid to sit in front of a computer and watch an AI program, and we were just in charge of like feeding and giving our AI emotional support. That's our jobs, I think, in the future.
But it's also really interesting how these things work in reality. Like Mats Torgensen, he said he's often having discussions with Anders Heisberg, who's now creating or maintaining or designing, I don't know, TypeScript, and they look at each other's work and try to incorporate that, which is a good thing. In terms of C#, I must say, just recently there was also the discussion: why do you still prefix private fields with an underscore? I mean, I don't know. I kind of learned it that way. I will probably also, if there are init only properties, I think I would still probably prefer the private fields. Read only, I don't know. Maybe with time, but currently I can't see myself using. I think I've never used private properties. They're either protected or public. I don't know how that came that way.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
The same. If they're private, then they're fields, in my mind.
Yeah.
But then I'd always use this dot my private field rather than underscore something.
I mean, there is also some kind of confidence behind that. I mean, between the two concepts, because with properties, you can't be sure if that's just data access or if it has an actual implementation, right? I mean, there's the guideline that you shouldn't do too much work. There's just a guideline.
Yeah, I mean, I will say having to do Xamarin samples for JetBrains and kind of delving into that space and looking at what that Xamarin community is doing with properties and interfaces like iNotify property changed, there is more of a compelling reason to have things like private properties, because you might have properties that you're changing in terms of data, but then cascade those property change events up to other public properties. And you might want to update your UI even when private values are changing. If it's a field, you kind of have to manage that a little differently than you would public properties. So I can see the use case for it, especially from those communities. But again, I'm still pretty new to Xamarin, so I'd be curious to ask Xamarin people if they're taking advantage of private properties or they're using some other kind of notify property change mechanism.
I don't think you can
private
bind
fields.
to private properties though. Like it has to be public. Or am I wrong?
You can call the iNotify property changed method, right? I think so.
Yeah, but you can't bind to property from the view if it's private.
Yeah, I'm saying they're probably not binding to the private property, but there's another property that depends on that private property. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
it's like it's cascading. So let's say you have a timer running in the background, like a background thread that updates this private field, and then other public properties take advantage of that. So I could see that being an advantage, but yeah, I mean, in web applications, I probably wouldn't do this private property thing. I don't think it makes a ton of sense. But
honestly, like it would be nice if by C#15 or which version we were talking about it, C# would finally adopt like a better type system. Like, I mean, of course, Hindley-Milner type system would be the best, right, Jonathan? But I mean, even just looking at some very simple things, it seems like when I'm using C#, at least in my experience, I feel like a lot of the time I'm typing on the keyboard, I'm not actually thinking about what I'm typing because it's a lot of repetitive code and stuff. Like even when you define a new class and you have those properties, you do like public type property get set, and then repeat this like 5 times or however many. And for instance, again, with TypeScript, you just define an interface, and there is no like get set stuff. There is no necessity for public or private or whatever unless you actually have a class. And in most cases, it's always the same. And it really, like, after working a lot with it, I feel like I'm way more productive because of how little I have to do all of that seemingly unnecessary work there. And that when I'm returning and coding in C#, I really wish there was something like this maybe in some newer versions, so that it would simplify our lives.
Yeah. One thing I find actually can be confusing in F# is where you can have type aliases. And so if you have a function that returns some sort of object, but it's a type, you define the return type is actually an alias of that object. Sometimes when you then call that method and you get IntelliSense, it will give you the object rather than the type alias, or vice versa. And you then have to go, well, what the hell is that? You either have to remember that the type alias is for the object, or why is this method returning me this object? I was expecting the type alias. So I don't know whether, I think from an IDE point of view, that would be quite helpful to give you a clue as what it's doing.
Well, to improve that IntelliSense.
Sorry?
Improving that IntelliSense as well, like to help tell you what you're looking at. Yeah.
Well, I guess the question I have is like, why type alias, right? Like, what's the point?
Say you've got a task, you're returning a task. In F# you have a result object, which is it basically encapsulates a happy path or a sad path.
Mm-hmm.
So you've now got task less than result less than object, comma, error object greater than. So whilst it's explicit and you can see, well, this is returning me a task, which I now have to wait for. It's then returning me a result object, which I then have to match on whether we've got a happy path or a sad path. Just for brevity or cleanliness, you could argue, I'll create a type alias which says type equals type Khalid's response equals, and then this large generic object. And so when you're working with it, you go, oh, I know this is a Khalid response. But actually, when you forget what the hell that is, you then have to hit F12 and go, right, okay, it's a task result, yada yada.
I mean, how dare you suggest people forget me? No, I'm just
exactly. I think we should put that into C#15.
Like writing with type inference in IntelliSense in F# is actually funny. Like you might be writing code and then you invoke a function and forget like the last argument, and suddenly instead of Khalid result, you have like -a tuple -b, one tuple, then maybe something else, then some result. And it's not an error, it's just what your function now isn't, like the type of your function, how it's inferred from the code. And you're like, okay, where did I screw up? Like, it's really hard to figure these things out sometimes.
I can see, like with partial application, it's powerful, but bloody confusing if you don't know it's partial application.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I've been lobbying the F# guy who works for doing the rider stuff to give me some sort of hint that this function that I've called is actually a partial application. I still need to pass in the final 3 arguments, because otherwise you come to it and you go, right, well that function's got 3 arguments, and actually it's actually got 6, but you don't actually know that yet. But
I will say the folks at JetBrains are really appreciative of all the feedback, and they love they love just kind of looking at stuff and seeing maybe from a different perspective, like what people are doing. So I know that feedback's always appreciated for sure.
Yeah, they're very good.
So with C#15, we talked about the language, but from like a platform, obviously C# usually ships with its sister .NET framework, .NET toolset. Like, Olga, what do you think .NET 15 would bring for someone doing DevOps?
That's an interesting question. I have to think about this. I don't know. It'll create the resources for you without having to use infrastructure as code.
So more or less infrastructure as code, or
I guess the .NET version of infrastructure as code, so you don't have to have an external tool. That
I mean, I will be the person that says F# does that right now. I guess with Farmer and stuff like that, you can write infrastructure as F# code.
I mean, you can write I don't know, actually. You can write certainly C# for Pulumi. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but it's certainly in beta.
And so I mean, you can
write your. Sorry?
I was going to say, and you can always use the APIs provided to use C# to hit those and technically write infrastructure as code using C# if you need it to as well.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of brings up an interesting dilemma for me, right? Because how tightly do you integrate the framework and the language with actual technologies like cloud providers like Google, Azure, AWS? Well, I get like 5 Bitcoins every time I mention any of those cloud providers. So for the rest of this talk, it's just going to be me repeating them.
But so you are a fan of multi-cloud then?
No, I wouldn't say that. I guess my concern is like there's a competitive advantage for Microsoft in the case that they're building the .NET tooling to make it as Azure friendly as possible. And not saying that they would do this, but to make it very, very difficult to use any other cloud provider, right? Like their funnel is to try to get you into Azure as quickly as possible.
Well, that's true. Why I just don't understand why they would want to deter you from using other cloud providers, because you might actually be choosing to use, like say .NET or whatever, because, but like as a secondary thing to say, oh, I want this specific cloud provider. So it might go the other way as well.
But they won't make any money, will they?
Well, it's
C# for Google Cloud or AWS. Yes, the framework's free and all VS Code's free. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. You can do lots of things in .NET and never deploy it to Azure. So their plan is, as Khalid says, is to ideally try and get you to chuck it onto a VM in Azure or something.
But why exactly to the language itself? I mean, I would go bonkers if I realized that they only push their own and really make it hard for others to get into that space. But I think one thing that is really, I mean, looking at the question with C# 9009 in a couple of years, I think one thing that I still miss, which is really great with Kotlin, is a good way to write a domain-specific language with C# as the host language. That's kind of missing for me, because in Kotlin, you can I hope this is still correct, but the thing what you can do is if you would define a method in C#, let's say, and usually you have the parentheses and pass the argument. But in Kotlin, what you can do is to open another curly brace, and that will be the argument. So always the last argument, I think, can be written with this curly brace syntax, and that allows you to write very nice domain-specific languages. They did it with the Gradle Kotlin adaptation or module which is sitting on top of it. They do it with with the Space API now. Yeah, at least 2 examples. Yeah.
Yeah, I think someone who does DevOps like Olga does, like it's kind of amazing what you can do in Kotlin, which is you can define your own operators, and they're almost treated like first-class citizens. So like in the analogous operators that you could think of in C#, like is and as operators, right? And
You can do it in F# as well.
but I get what Matthias is saying, as like it would be amazing if you could just define your own vocabulary and it would be completely valid C#. I think the only problem with that is most people are insane, and like, if it's difficult to get into open source now or to like onboard onto teams, imagine people with the ability to essentially make like C# like generic version. It's not.
I'm pretty sure I saw something a few years ago.
It's Jonathan Cola, and I think that would be kind of.
Yeah.
I'm
we
pretty
have
sure I saw something a few years back where something in Roslyn that somebody did where you could effectively do the same thing. So I think there was a Swedish guy who was obviously writing C# and using English language to write his programs in, and there was something in Roslyn where he could basically turn everything to Swedish effectively, and so when you read it, it was all in Swedish. But for an English speaker reading C#, you just thought, what the hell is this? But it was some, it was some Roslyn plugin which you could effectively do that.
Khalid and we have very different views onto the world. I say people are mostly good. You say everyone is insane.
I don't think being good and insane. Yeah, I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive. I mean, you could be a good insane person and a sane evil person. So
that's right. But by the way, I forgot to include some of the chat comments. So first one, question for you, Jonathan. What would you rather fight, one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses?
This is Joe, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not answering that. The amount of times I've heard that question working with him, shocking.
By the way, I wanted to ask you. You work at Software Park, right?
I do.
And I'm not sure if I asked you already, but this is a Vienna-based company.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think I know I just had to look it up, but Jörg Egritzberger, that's the CEO, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was leading the one of the .NET meetups in Vienna. Yeah, I remember him. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think I also was at their building once. I don't know why, but the thing
they've got a main office in Vienna. I think they've got another office somewhere else. They've got a team in, I can't remember the name now, somewhere in Russia beginning with U. And then we've got various people across Europe.
Interesting. Also, Joseph said there's an alternative ending for I Am Legend. I just watched it very briefly. There's some hugging involved, but I also shared the links. I haven't seen a single horse actually, but
any ducks?
Not even a tiny one. No, only those weird-looking people, which are a bit like
talk about Khalid like that.
Which are a bit like vampires. They don't like the sun. Well, anyways, and a more serious remark, probably, I suppose, an advantage is it can be an on-ramp from other cloud providers to Azure. So speaking of the more integrated part on the Azure side, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead. No, you go. Age
mean,
before beauty, I guess.
I'm only 21.
Wow, that's a hard 21. All right,
I
go.
had a hard paper round. But I was just thinking, there's not a large jump, is there, from a .NET template to a cloud-specific sort of infrastructure as code thing? You can kind of see it maybe evolving. Maybe.
I think the major jump is in the DevOps part of it, not in the code.
Yeah.
As far as like accessibility of creating resources, you mean, or just But
I mean,
I'm really impressed. Go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know if there's an API or an SDK for Azure to do that kind of thing. I mean, I assume there probably is. But then again, I guess that's what Pharma is trying to do.
Didn't they make like their own language, or trying to push their own language for defining configuration files? Yeah.
I mean,
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, you had Terraform in your webinar, Olga. And from my experience using Terraform and really any of these like domain specific languages for cloud providers is like, they're always at least 1 or 2 steps behind the actual feature set that's in the cloud. And it's funny because kind of JetBrains has to deal with this as well, providing .NET tooling. Like, we're always just like one or 2 seconds behind kind of where the .NET framework is. JetBrains always gets there and they innovate in that space, but I imagine Terraform, Pulumi, Farmer, they're always going to be like 1 step behind where they need to be, right?
Yeah, and some and that's why some companies choose to go with the cloud-specific version of the infrastructure as code. Like, I don't know, maybe like using Bicep or something. I know that's fairly new, but like before ARM templates. But even those had their limitations. I mean, I have a lot of gripes with Terraform, but it also helps at least. Like if you're ever like not sure that you want to stay with one specific provider, it's still really helpful to be able to have something that is like that, even if it's a little bit behind on everything else. It really depends on like what it is that you're doing as well. But no, I can definitely see your point.
Yeah, it kind of goes. It kind of ties into like Alexey's post about fakes and stubs too. It kind of reminds me of this maybe philosophy that was around with .NET maybe like a decade ago. Damn, I'm old. Which is like to basically have and increase your confidence that things are going to work. You use like the simplest baseline functionality and features that are possibly there. So like in terms of risk mitigation, you either simplify your code so that it does like basic reads and use patterns like the repository pattern so that you can take advantage of those features. You just do like the simplest thing possible so you can like test those things. But I can see infrastructure going that way too, where it's like, maybe I don't use Cosmos DB because it locks me into Azure, or I don't use those things. I just use the simplest form that there's like analogous feature sets across all clouds. But I think you're almost doing yourself a disservice by building software like that. I mean, I don't know what people's thoughts are on that.
I also feel like it will complicate things in its own way, right? And then you're also going to have to continuously think about, okay, well, what is the basic thing that is that I have to do? Like, there's still like somewhat of a line, and you might have to like look up things like, oh, I can't do distributed transactions, okay, like, or it's somewhat like less complex manner, it adds that complexity back in other ways. So
I also think that those abstractions are in many ways superficial. Like it's on one hand, people keep saying that, oh, what if I want to change the database to some other provider? Why don't I like put a million different repositories, and then never end up changing anything? And on the other hand, for instance, I'm using Postgres, and there are different extensions for it. For instance, like to remove accents from a string or something. And by using them, I take dependency on the fact that I'm using Postgres, my database. But if I wanted to have like an abstraction that I could easily like change from SQL Server from Postgres to SQL Server or something, I wouldn't be able to do that. But I feel like it's much easier to just take this extension. If I end up changing to a different database, just rewrite it to a different extension that SQL Server supports or whatever. I think it's even more apparent like with queues, when people sometimes like make some abstraction IQ or whatever, and then they have RabbitMQ for local setup or whatever, or maybe staging, and then they have Kafka in the cloud, and they pretend they're the same, right? But they're not, and there are different aspects of them that are quite important. But by putting them under a single umbrella, you're losing out on a lot of the different functionalities that they provide, and also like you don't take advantage from what makes them unique and stuff like this.
Yeah, Jonathan, you're old too. Like, do you remember that? Do you remember that transition?
Oh yeah, just had a hard paper round.
Well, I'm asking you from one senior experienced scarred .NET developer to another. Like, Alexey made a lot of good points that I believe in today, which is like, if you're going to pick a technology, just commit to that technology because you chose it for specific reasons, right? You didn't just like pick a random one out of a hat. I mean, do you remember that mental shift happen in the .NET community, or do you even think that mental shift has happened in the .NET community?
I think it has with some people and it hasn't with others. I think there's still a very much big set of developers which follow strict patterns and dogma that come out of blog posts and books and things like that. And I don't think that's probably, well, I hope it's not just .NET programmers. I guess the idea is to have some sort of framework so you can easily get the job done, right? You're trying to solve a problem and you get it done. But as you say, is if you follow something dogmatically and you're trying to solve a problem and it doesn't address that, you're not gonna win that, are you? You're not gonna solve your problem. Whereas if you actually take a step back and go, what are we trying to solve and what do we need? Then think for yourself almost a bit more. Then I think that's when you're going to succeed. And I think, as I say, I hope it's not just .NET developers that seem to follow a dogmatic approach because thought leaders have told them to use something or take a certain approach.
Well, let me ask this general question of everybody. Sorry, I saw you unmuted yourself, Olga. You want to say something before I ask my question?
Go ahead, ask your question.
Obviously, those patterns that you were referencing, Jonathan, were written in a time where there was like infrastructure constraints, memory constraints, like just a different context completely. Do you feel like a lot of those patterns are valuable for developers today, or do you feel like we almost need to reevaluate, all of them and see which ones are actually most valuable given our current context?
I think the problem with that is you then have to learn every pattern to then go back and try and make sure it's valid in today's programming. I mean, a generic repository was never a good idea in my opinion, but I'm sure there's still lots of people using it and find value from it. But you know, it's there's no harm in going back and reevaluating all the patterns, is there?
Yeah, and I'm sure with that you can kind of go both ways, right? There's some that could be extended to like larger initiatives, like say, single responsibility principle now can be extended to say an entire service as opposed to just like a specific function. And then vice versa, there's probably definitely a lot of stuff that could be deprecated.
I mean, I think one.
Actually,
sorry, go on.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's like it's not about going back and reevaluating those principles. It's actually understanding, like the thing about human mind, I guess it's a little bit philosophical to get into this, but like we usually see a problem, we encounter a problem, right? And then we solve it. And then instead of remembering like the thought process that led us to some solution, we only remember the solution. So the next time we end up with a similar problem, we just remember that we had the solution and try to apply it. But the thing is, the circumstances always change, or they might change at least. And so you should have been able, instead of like applying the same solution, you should try to apply the same thought process, and you might actually end up with a different solution depending on the context. And I think like all of those principles, they make perfect sense, but their applicability in different contexts is different. Like everything changes all the time, so you can't just, oh, repository, I read it, it was the best practice. Like they wouldn't say it is if it wasn't, right? So let me just use it. But that's a bad idea if you do this.
I feel you're about to say it depends.
Yeah,
that's like the universal answer, right? Like
I was going to chime in with that too. That mindfulness-driven design too.
Yeah, I guess once you reach like architect level, your answer is always it depends, right?
Context is king.
Tell me your problems.
It's just interesting to me. I mean, I guess to me, coming from a larger team, I just found that rather than kind of looking for a digital prophet out in the tech wilderness, it's better to think about, like Olga was saying, mindful, design and thinking through things and actually talking to each other. Sometimes I feel we lean on patterns because they somehow, if we all just focus on the patterns, we don't actually have to talk to the developer next to us, right?
Well, they give you a false sense of security, don't they? They kind of give you, oh, well, this is a structure, and if you do this, you'll be set, you'll be fine.
So I can treat developers like cogs, and here's the interface. I'm the architect. I designed this. Go implement this interface, and don't talk to anybody.
Like what?
What'd you say?
You treat developers like
Cogs.
what?
COGS, like cogs in the machine. You need to get your mind out of the gutter.
Okay.
But
unless they're really mean developers.
But I guess to me that's the interesting part. It's like, I think I said this the other day, I feel like teams could probably benefit less, or they'd benefit more from less architecture and more therapy and psychologists on the team, because
I've got a degree in psychology. That can help, maybe.
Hey, that's fantastic.
I might send you all mad, but
But I think to me, like actually having discussions and trying to narrow down what the vision is and focusing on that is going to yield to more success than people dogmatically pulling out patterns and throwing books and blog posts at each other. I think
another reason for the patterns we had and the things that went around was an attempt to allow developers to communicate. And, when you say one thing, I understand it as one thing. I don't interpret it as something else, which is always the danger, right? I think you're saying this, and you think I'm interpreting what you're saying as that, but actually I'd interpret it as something else. But I think that came with it is that, we're talking about this, and therefore, okay, everyone's going to follow this very strictly, and therefore, actually, you solve your problem 90%, but not actually what it is. Whereas I think what you're saying is, if people talk more and understand the problem they're solving and the context they are in and how they're going to do this, they can then develop their own language in that team to then understand what they are actually talking about.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, team members are probably the people you spend most of your time with. Like if you're a day-to-day business dev, right? Like you likely spend more time with your team members than you do your spouse, your family.
Yeah.
So that line of communication is super important. And for me, the most rewarding relationships on a team I've found is once you get past the point where you take someone's feedback personally, right? Like for me, some of my favorite collaborators that I've worked with in the past, we could be as honest as we needed to be, and we knew we weren't like attacking each other.
Do you think that's becoming harder in the now post-COVID work from home, remote? Do you think it's harder to forge relationships than it is sitting in an office?
I don't know. I guess to me, it depends your locale and stuff. Like working at JetBrains, I kind of tweeted a joke the other day that I'm the only .NET advocate in America. And there's definitely like a window as to where I can like communicate with Matthias and some of the other .NET devs. So if you're working in a global environment, I think it is harder to kind of foster those relationships. You might need to adjust. But if you're working remote and you're only within like 1 or 2 time zones, I think you can still do that. It's just important to make sure that like, you know, I always say this, people are kind of messy. Everyone kind of has their quirks and everyone has their kind of like triggers, their insecurities. And I think it's important to try to get to a point in a team where you understand people and you can empathize with them. But at the same time, those aren't like things you need to walk on eggshells around, right? Like, I think that's the hard part of building a team. It's about fostering those kind of relationships and sharing those same motivations moving forward most of the time, right? So like coming from a directorship, like being a director for a while, I found that was the hardest part, just kind of trying to keep the team's momentum moving forward. And I would say 80% of my challenges were never really technical. They were that keeping the team momentum up. And I think that's not a technical problem, right?
Yeah.
So,
but do you think that becomes an issue with remoteness? Because I think even with all the best technology you can have, and having remote calls, there's still something about being 6 feet apart and just talking and having a laugh, and you build that. I think you build that relationship easier. I've been remote 6-7 years, and I don't think nothing makes up for the fact that if you go and actually meet your team in a bar or go-karting or just sitting in the hotel lounge talking, you build a relationship much easier, I think, over a few hours rather than over a Zoom call. It's not to say that relationship never comes, but I think it probably may take longer.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And then, I've been working at a company that has been like remote friendly for a while, where we have remote colleagues, and then we can come into the office whenever we want to, but we can also be remote whenever we need to. And there is a huge difference, right? And like that water cooler conversations, like having somebody sit like 6 feet apart, like those kinds of conversations can start with like, hey, how was your weekend? And then you're like, next thing you know, you're re-architecting a whole thing, or you're learning something that's like very insightful. Like my boss is like full of very interesting information, and I'm always like learning stuff from him. So you don't really like get that as much. But then again, with COVID and like companies having to be more remote friendly, they've made like some have made like special like accommodations for that kind of stuff. Like they would encourage, say, oh, maybe 2 hours a week, spend some time on a Zoom call with your colleagues, not talking about work, just doing whatever, or schedule like one-on-one coffee chats or something like that, because I know that I'm a lot more chatty one-on-one than I am in groups. And so I feel like I would definitely get a lot more out of that, and then I would be more comfortable within the group setting as well. And then it's not entirely not impossible, or it's not like a complete replacement. Like you're never going to feel like you're physically there, but I feel like there's still a lot of things that you can do to increase that sort of sense of connectivity and camaraderie.
I think, I mean, I was just thinking when you said that, my last place, every Friday we all sat on a call at about 3 or 4 o'clock, had a few beers, and tried to discuss non-work stuff. We had water cooler Slack rooms that anyone could jump into and have a chat at any point. But I think that certainly helps. But I think the spontaneity behind, I'm just going to go and get a coffee. Oh, I've seen you in the kitchen. Let's have we have a chat. That goes, because then it's like, well, I've got a call on Friday at 3 o'clock. We have to be nice to each other and talk. It's you lose the spontaneity. I think it certainly helps, to still build the relationships. And obviously, when you then meet, you're not having to then start from scratch. But I just think that is something fundamental about human contact.
It's funny to me because like forced interaction to me is always like awkward as hell.
Well, it goes back to those corporate,
like today.
This is hell awkward.
It goes back to those corporate days where we're going to all stand behind each other and then just
do trust falls.
Yeah, we're now best buddies because you trust me.
I think I have kind of a déjà vu if I say this, but with my previous team, I was the initiator to have like a beer for once a week at least. And eventually what happened is that with 2 of them, I went out like every weekend. And also eventually we got beaten up together, and the next day was the company celebration day with some of our customers, and our boss was like, oh, what the hell happened to you? Like we were
team
out.
building.
It was a team building event. Yeah, right. I mean, it wasn't our fault, I have to say. We're not aggressive. It was them, or it was a single person.
Were they advocating for mocks?
Was it an F?
Yes. Yeah, it's exactly like what you mean. Someone said mocks are cool, and then this happened. Yeah.
Hey, don't joke around about that, because so I used to bartend back when I was in college, and people would get into fights, like bar fights, over the silliest things. It starts with something very small that is very insignificant, but then it escalates quickly into something, and then before you know it, they're fighting. So it could have been something like mocks.
I can
reply for that without any reason.
I can put on top of that. I had my friend over from university who was visiting me in Vienna. First evening, he arrived with his girlfriend. We went into the bar. Someone approaches me and asks, "Can I beat up your friend?" Like really, it was like, I don't know, it's my property or something. He really said, "Could we have a fight?" Like a friendly fight, and then I don't know, go to dinner afterwards or before.
Is this Austrian polite manners before beating the shit out of people that you
I
asked
have
first.
no idea, but it was weird as hell.
It's a mating ritual.
Are they Klingon?
No, but he's very. I mean, my friend was very tall and probably twice the size as me. So some just feel like they need to, I don't know,
But from
test
the
their
way you
ability.
They got issues.
from the way you described it, you said that you were beaten up. You didn't say that you were beating up somebody or that you had a fight. So I guess they had more taller friends or something.
Well, when the time when we got beaten up, it was really just one person. Yeah, and he was
Oh.
very aggressive. We were in the wrong place, but yeah, every one of us got their part in that.
It sounds like you should
Very
take some
great.
kung fu lessons from Rodney.
Yeah, maybe.
That's what you get for going outside and not staying at home, you know, working.
Yeah, true.
Dangerous to go out there.
That serves me right? Not being a proper
Exactly.
developer, should have stayed at home.
Actually, like when I started working remote a year ago, I was like, there's like whenever we went out with a group of people at my work, and somebody would ask how are we working? Are we like going to the office or working remote? Everybody would say that, oh, we're working remote, but Alexey, he's working full remote. Yeah, so that was like a running joke that I never go outside. So whenever somebody, gets into an accident or breaks their arm or something, I would say that, serves you right for going outside.
Wow, this podcast or meeting went very dark. We're talking about beating people, lack of human contact, breaking arms.
Not beating, getting beaten.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll hug as well. Hey,
Sounds like a developer fight club.
You know what? I guess it's interesting though. It's like, have we lost something as a society without being in the same office with people? I don't know. I think there's pros and cons for sure.
Depends on the personality type, though.
Yes.
I think it depends on the company too, right? Like, if you work within a pressure cooker style company, that it's like everything you do is gonna make or break the company. Like, even if you sit in an office with a bunch of people, it's probably so stressful that it's like there's probably no time to make small talk, right? I don't know. Maybe.
At that point, you might want to look for a new job, or you might want to look to talk to whoever your superiors are into possibly hiring more people or developing better practices.
Yeah. Again, it's like there's yes, those are good things. It's just not always possible, right? Like, there's just toxic environments. I mean,
Absolutely, you're not going to change everybody's minds all the time.
yeah.
But, yes.
I mean, I was speaking to a guy yesterday who, I'm not entirely sure what he does, but he's in charge of a team or a couple of teams across the country, and their main business is manufacturing. And I said to him, how is he getting on? Is he still working from home? Because obviously when COVID kicked in, everyone was locked down and told to work from home. And for them, obviously, working from home is pretty much impossible because they're all in a factory manufacturing something. So, I mean, obviously, for him, he was a sort of project manager for it. So you can do a couple of days at home doing whatever project managers do, making pretty graphs and writing emails. But he still has to go, obviously, on site and see people who are in the factory. So, it depends.
Yeah, I mean, it always depends, right?
Yeah.
Again, that's kind of why I go back to this idea of like, you need to talk to team members, and your practices as a team are going to evolve organically from the people on your team and what your team feels comfortable doing, right? Like, you're not going to adopt some other team's philosophies and it's going to go smoothly, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's where more, as you say, you said earlier about has it changed over the years. I think now there's more emphasis on self-team management, right, rather than a waterfall architect person saying, right, each team has to do this and follow this, etc. You can have different people in different teams, and some people are going to get on and some people aren't, but you've got to find a way to all work together, right? And having the autonomy to be able to decide how are we actually going to succeed and solve the problem.
Yeah. I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry.
I wasn't going to add anything constructive. I was just going to say self-organizing teams are very interesting as far as dynamic goes, and you have to have at least one person who's willing to kind of understand how to communicate, to be able to kind of set the tone for that team.
It's going to be tricky if you've got 6 team members who are introverted and, don't like talking. I mean, I would advocate that if you are working remotely, that having your video on is a must. There's so much non-verbal communication that if you're that introverted that you've got to turn your camera off and only talk via text chat, then if you've got a whole team like that, it's just you're not gonna win.
I would. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I would also put that in the it depends category as well, even though the benefits are absolutely there. And it's great to have the video on with the pandemic and everything and people having like children at home and all of this other stuff. It makes things a lot more difficult to be in a presentable space. So
you can do, but then you have to be, people have to accept that, you've not got a perfect background and a perfect life. I mean, I remember interviewing for my current job, and Jorg's child came in and said hello and wanted to talk to his dad and stuff like that, and it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, it kind of brings up an interesting thought for me. Is like, is success of a team, is it something that is planned and executed with precision, or is success kind of an emergent side effect of a functioning team, right? Like, a functioning team understands what the goals are and they aim for those, but obviously success can take many forms. Is success kind of just a side effect of a good team, right?
You can't plan for everything though, can you?
Goals change all the time.
So I mean, if you take a Mercedes Formula One team, obviously they're going to be like, right, we've got to be the best of the best, and this is the plan. But they've all been working together for 8 years, and they now know how to work as a team to get the best out of everything, right? And I guess that goes for any team. I mean, you can set plans and say, well, this is the goal, and we're going to be super duper because we've got all these plans. But if your team's not functioning well, then it's not going to happen, is it? So I guess it can be a bit of both.
So it depends.
So today's takeaway is it depends.
Yeah, this is going to be really interesting. It's just going to be 2 hours of us saying it depends.
And that F# is superior, clearly.
We should definitely ask for pay rises because we sound like we know what we're talking about.
Well, that's the thing. The more you learn, the more you realize that everything is not so cut and dry, that there's no like cookie cutter solution. You can't just use a .NET template to
Yeah, I think that's a Socrates quote. It's like the smarter I get, the only thing I'm aware of is my own ignorance, or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm in another .NET Telegram channel. I was laughing so hard the other day when I saw this I don't know. It looks like the background which Khalid is using for his blog post. What is that? Tor or something? Or Tron?
Tron, yeah, it's the grid.
Yeah, and it was that background with the typical font, etc. And it said something like, and it's like very dull. It said sounds like F# propaganda, but okay. Was nothing so.
You'll have to find that and put a link so that folks can see it. But
it's a sticker on Instagram. You can use it yourself, but I will try to find it. Yeah.
What's Instagram for seniors like me and Jonathan? We don't know what that is. Is that where kids go to?
We just post photo albums to each
I
other.
said Twitter. Did I said Instagram? I meant Telegram. Sorry.
It's like 3 different things.
Oh man,
he's so old. He just gets confused.
Yeah. I'm just so nervous, you know.
Social media is hard.
Yeah.
What are you snacking on, Jonathan? Oh, look at that. Kit Kat.
Is that a single Kit Kat?
Yeah, 2 fingers.
Oh, okay.
In America, we have like a 20 pack, which is like just one big bar that we shove into our face.
It's part of your
king size family pack that is for one.
Yeah.
It's part of your recommended daily allowances, right?
Shove into your face.
It's not good here.
And all of the foods are either like supreme or ultimate or like some crazy version of all the things, like giant foods.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure diabetes is the national bird. So
I remember I was in California. Christ, 2010 maybe. No, more than that. 2012. And they just they've been forced. All restaurants have been forced to put calories on the menu. So when you went out, they had to say, "Oh, it was amazing." It was like 3,000 calories for this, meal. Well, not even a meal, just a main dish.
Yeah,
I bet it tastes great.
I went to the
sure
I went to the Popeyes drive-thru the other day, and like a 3 tender box was like 1,500 calories or something like that. It's crazy.
I got some very strange looks when I was like ordering off the kids menu because it was like 600 calories or something.
You know what's funny? Like America's been very good at exporting its obesity epidemic. When I was in China, they were talking about what they call little fat Chinese kids. They call them like little princes because, like, I guess China is having an obesity epidemic because we're exporting McDonald's, and KFC is like the number one chain there in China. It's like on every single corner. The country where I'm originally from, Kuwait, I think 50% of the population is like pre-diabetic or something like that. So it's because all the fast food chains.
Yeah. I think the UK is probably one of the highest in Europe.
So let me ask you this. Like, do you feel like Brexit has done anything in terms of your job prospects? Like, how do you feel about that?
Oh, getting deep now, aren't we?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, my last 2 employers have been outside of the UK. So does that say anything? Maybe not. Maybe that's just coincidence.
So you're the immigrant taking people's jobs.
Yeah. I think Switzerland and Austria are probably going to be okay though.
No, it's kind of crazy. I mean, I don't know.
I certainly think I'm not sure it's Brexit as such, but they're sort of changing tax situation for people who run their own businesses, and a lot of developers who do contracting will have their own limited company, and they charge through that way, and they're bringing in tax changes to make it less worthwhile for people to be contractors. So then it makes it more beneficial to get a job outside of the UK for these people. I don't think it's tied to Brexit directly, but I guess it could be argued maybe. But I don't know. I think we're just going to have to wait and see. I don't think it is harder at the moment, but I wouldn't be surprised if that did change.
Do you folks on the call feel like in this COVID like pandemic era, do you feel like your prospects are better, worse, or just about the same as a developer?
I think they're even better.
Better.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, because working in I don't work in a large city. I don't live in a large city, but it's not like a small town either. It's like a medium-sized city, but the cost of living is very low, so it's very attractive to live here. But then again, the salaries aren't as great either, and so with going remote, and with more companies going remote, there's more. There are multiple things that have been happening. So more opportunities to work in other cities remotely while living in the smaller cost of living area, or the employers in those smaller towns, if they're part of say a larger global company like mine is, they have more incentive to standardize those salaries a little bit more. So the salaries that you're getting working in that area are now a little bit higher as a result of having these opportunities for working in bigger cities. So it's advantageous in both ways, which is really sad, because I know that there are a lot of folks who are not getting that.
Yeah, I mean, Phil Hack had an interesting blog post this week about basically the gist of it is you shouldn't pay anybody less than you would pay anyone else, depending on their location in the world. And I wonder what the average tech salary is going to be if every company ultimately becomes a global company in some respect, right? Or at least national. You almost have this average salary. I wonder where the average developer salary is going to fall once you start thinking about that in a worldwide setting, right?
It gets tricky, right? Because certainly worldwide, more so. I think certainly for someone from the UK looking at what a developer earns in the US, it's probably at least twice, if not 3 times as much. But then you've got healthcare to pay for and lots of other things that a lot of countries in Europe don't have. And the same, I guess, applies to someone in India who's a developer and looks at the gap between what their average developer in India earns compared to someone in the States. It's going to be a huge difference, I imagine. So how you even try and standardize that? It's
I know Basecamp, bring it back to DHH. I know Basecamp's philosophy is if they hire anybody, they pay them San Francisco wages, right? Mm-hmm. So you pick a locale, and then you essentially expand your border globally. So San Francisco rate for everybody.
You've got to be a very successful business.
Well, they also have a limited number of seats open, right? They're just not throwing people at problems.
Yeah.
I feel like it would also be much harder for startups to get up and running as well, especially if you are taking advantage of the smaller cost of living cities to be able to get your company up and running, and then you might not be able to survive as much if you have to pay higher wages. Not that I'm advocating for lower wages or anything like that, but I'm just saying like it definitely is not as easy as it sounds.
I think also like on a smaller scale, not even talking about the global scale, it's quite interesting because, for instance, like there is this overpopulation factor in larger cities because there are more job opportunities there. And so, for instance, I live in the capital, right? And I can actually see how that COVID dynamic has impacted that, because there's a lot of people coming from all over across the country here because there is simply more job opportunities here, and that has the detrimental impact on the transport. I guess a lot of people is never good for anybody. Also, like the rents, the real estate. And from that perspective, it's pretty interesting. Like you can actually work from wherever you live. You don't have to move to close to your office or whatever. And that would, impact the economy because there's fewer reasons to buy a house closer to your office or rent a house, apartment or whatever. And, stuff like this. And it's really interesting how that would work out, because I would prefer if people didn't have to like move closer to their jobs, because that causes a lot of unrelated problems. And if remote work could fix that, I think this is a very beneficial thing going forward.
I mean,
Yeah,
go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there was a thing a few weeks ago from our Prime Minister was like, everyone must get back to their office jobs. And it's not because of any COVID safe. It's because of all the businesses that were losing out on, sandwich buys and coffee and things like that. And therefore, because they weren't being funded by the workers, they will then shut down the shops, which then has a knock-on effect that the owner of that shop or building doesn't get the rent. Oh, and it just so happens that most of these people are in government and own all these places. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one if more and more people do work from home.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for me, and I'm curious to see what happens in the next, say, 3 years to 5 years. But like, how are hiring practices going to change? How are people's salaries going to change? I think a lot of people realize that the interviewing process for tech companies is kind of a shit show, right? Yeah, to be honest, even when I interviewed people, it was always a gamble, right? Like someone could do great in an interview and then you find out they're like a Nazi. That literally happened to me, by the way.
Oh my god.
That's for next week.
But yeah, it becomes like this other like game that you have to play, and so like they write books like Cracking the Coding Interview that prepares you for the coding interview. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily what you're going to be doing on the job, and and vice versa. You could be really great at the interview, and then you could suck at the job.
Yeah, I mean, someone said to me a few years ago actually that going on interview is like going on a date, mm-hmm. right? You project the best version of you, and they project the best version of the company. You pass the kind of test that you seem like you know what you're talking about, and this company seems like they're nice and friendly and everything's going to be there, but you join and then they realize you're utterly useless at your job, or you join and you realize that the company's an absolute nightmare. Mm-hmm. So, and the same with dating, you kind of meet people and everything looks okay, but then you realize Khalid leaves his pants everywhere and all over the floor after 6 months. And,
lucky if I wear pants. No, I'm just joking.
Nice.
I'm wearing shorts.
Please stand up for a moment.
No. No, but it is very much always a gamble, right? So it's like, it kind of gets back to the idea of like philosophically as a team and psychologically, where do you want to sit as a company? Do you want to lean towards good faith and trusting people, or do you want to be very untrusting of people? Like seeing interviews where there's like 3, 4, 5 interviews, just to get into the company, I think that's kind of disrespectful of people's time, both inside the company and outside.
It's a big boundary to entry, or whatever you call it. But yeah, if you're somebody who has children and or like young children that are very involved to take care of, and you're too busy, trying to make ends meet right now, so you're interviewing for a job to help things, but at the time, it becomes a very, very difficult process.
Yeah.
I
my wife's applied for jobs over the last few years, and it's interesting, and I'm glad I don't have to do it, is the application forms that she has to fill in. He was like, tell me about yourself, your employment history, all this, personal statements, and and then you do all that, and then you spend 3 days getting it perfect, and you never hear anything again. You just think, we gave it to someone internally, or there's so much effort in that process of getting people to apply for jobs. That has to change. For non-developers, I don't know what the solution is to that, but an application form where people are spending days trying to get it perfect, and the questions they ask are just ridiculous.
Or like, give me your resume, but also fill out this form that includes everything that's on your resume.
Yeah.
Well, I think the Europeans on this call definitely have a bigger advantage. Europe is probably more in favor of the worker rather than the employer, right?
Yeah.
Europeans, for the most part, have universal health care, so it helps mobility, like job mobility. So, like, employees in Europe, at least is my opinion, probably have a bigger advantage than, say, me and Olga, that we're kind of, depending on our circumstance, could be tied to an employer, even though we're intending not to work there, right? Like, maybe you have a pre-existing condition where your employer gives you the best healthcare and you can't really go anywhere because of that. Maybe you have
there's a lot more questions for you when you interview, in terms of, tell me about the job, blah blah blah. But then there's also, as you say, your personal circumstances are massively influenced by the employer. That I don't know. I mean, I guess you'd have loads of questions, but then does it come socially awkward to say, this is my medical history, and I need to understand the health package you're going to give me, and all this kind of stuff. It must be tricky.
It's totally normal to ask, but like, the employer can never actually ask you like what you need as far as that kind of stuff, because there's certain things
I mean, I
guess
it's similar here. Was when I think they changed a few years ago, was employers could never ask a woman if she was pregnant or if she planned to have children, because then they would obviously, well, not all of them obviously, but some would then penalize them, because you're 30 and you just got married, I think you might start a family soon, therefore you'll then not work as much, etc. And I think that became a law. You can ask that, and I'm quite right, but yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna just agree with your point, and that there's a lot of that going on, even like unconsciously as well. So it's not like people are thinking about this like consciously. Like, somebody says, "Oh, this is happening. This is my situation," and then you automatically like have this vision, and it becomes really difficult to break.
I will say there will be an advantage in this, like, post-pandemic. If more companies stay remote, I think teams will become more diverse, right? I know companies are experimenting with like blind interviews. I know Jonathan mentioned earlier that you should have the camera turned on, but people are trying to interview people in blind interviews because we all kind of do this, but we relate to people that look more like us than we do people that don't look like us,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
And I think when you look at teams, some, especially in .NET, you can have teams that just look like old white dudes across the board, and whether it's intentional or non-intentional, I'd like to believe it's non-intentional. It's just this like internal lizard brain bias that makes us relate to people that look more like us, right?
But I guess that's not specific to jobs. I guess that's a whole social structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously not, hopefully not as bad as it used to be in, 25 BC, but
it's getting better, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And then as far as like interviews go, some companies are no longer even asking for any specific like coding problems or even like technical knowledge. Like people are certain companies are actually like focusing more on having a conversation with the human and making their decisions that way as well, because like you don't have to be a computer science major with all of this knowledge to be able to like know how to use a specific language or learn how to use a specific language.
This is always the point, isn't it? It's like you hear of these interviews that say try and write a binary tree on a whiteboard, and it's like, I think when is that going to be useful? I mean, I've had an interview that springs to mind now where they asked me to do a technical test, and I was like, I nearly walked out because I was professional and stayed to the end, but I came out so angry because the questions they were asking and the task that they gave me, I was just like, how is this relevant to the job that you have posted? It's just,
I guess to me, that's why it's really important for people to make sure that they do work in public and to be transparent, not only to the community, but to themselves. Because ultimately, it's funny, you mentioned the analogy of a date, right? Well, like your online presence is essentially your public dating profile. And it can cut out a lot of the small talk in interviews. When someone comes in and they invite you to come in to talk, they kind of know what you're already about and what you can do and what you're interested in.
That has never worked out for me.
Sorry, go ahead. Say that again, Alexey?
Oh, I said that it never worked out for me. Like I always, like when I started doing open source, I had this naive idea that people, who, if I apply to jobs, people are like, oh, you're that guy that, made this library, you're awesome, let's just hire you, no interviews needed. And that never happened. Like nobody ever, at one point on the interview, when it was already done, somebody asked me, oh, what do you do in your free time? And I'm like, oh, I also do like open source and stuff. And one of the interviewers were, oh, so you were that guy. I remember somebody had like a GitHub profile or something. Like nobody actually gave a fuck. Or sorry, can I actually say that?
Yeah, you're fine.
Nobody cared about it. And it wasn't until the last job that I had, or like 2 months ago, that I got hired essentially because of that GitHub profile. But until then, it never happened to me. And I almost lost hope.
Yeah, I guess I'm not saying that it like makes you quote unquote famous. I mean, Matthias is famous for Nuke and Jonathan Carter and stuff like that. But it's not about being famous and immediately recognizable. It's about when someone has expressed interest in you. And I've done this as someone doing the interview process. It's nice to know and look at someone's public profile to just get a sense of who they are as a person.
It is nice to know, but I think there's a downside to it in that then, if that becomes the norm, it then forces people who have a life to then not spend time with their kids and write publicly visible code, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're pointing to Jonathan. Don't tell him he's ever right. No, I think again, for me though, it's like it's a competitive advantage. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's fair, but if you want to give yourself a competitive advantage and you want to have if you want to have better interviews that kind of cut through the dumb questions of like, tell me a little bit about yourself and what do you like to do in your free time? I think it behooves you to write and be public more than someone who's stuck behind a company wall.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not shaming people that can't do it. I understand their circumstances, but what I am saying is it is a clear competitive advantage. And every interview that I've gone to after doing stuff publicly, like blogging and open source, has been a lot easier because I always felt like the person across from me knew why I was there and why they wanted to hire me to begin with. So it was just the interview was just a formality in the sense of like, just to make sure Khalid's not crazy. Obviously JetBrains didn't do that very well. No, I'm just joking. But it's a formality, I think. But maybe I'm talking from a place of privilege. Obviously, the fact that, you know, I get to do the stuff publicly, and you know, I get these opportunities. So I understand that.
Yeah, I'm still trying to make time for that kind of stuff, and yeah, I can definitely understand what you're saying as far as like it gives people like a way to see what they're working with, as long as they take it as kind of like an idea, but not using it like completely. Like I don't know. I would probably like look at that kind of stuff after having the interview to see like, okay, well, this seems like a good person. What do they kind of know already? Just so I know what I'm working with, but not like having it be a barrier of entry or anything like that. Just to see like how much like maybe what kind of team to put you with, or what kind of people where you can learn from, or further learn from, or help. Because they're trying to integrate some tool that you're using or something like that. Like,
again, just to clarify, like any online presence is super important, right? Like for me, going through resumes where someone was a digital ghost, I think was just like an immediate red flag. Like, how can someone work in tech and be a complete ghost, like no online presence?
Have you talked to some security professionals? Because some of those guys are pretty low key when it comes to that. I mean, some of them are very opposite, but there are some that are pretty much against.
I'm imagining Khalid like opening up Instagram and like, okay, this guy is not here. Maybe on Twitter.
Well,
but he somehow ends up in your profile somehow.
Yeah.
Well,
again, this is actually one thing that I'm more against it. I mean, for me, I think it should not be a red flag, because it's still. I mean, I know a lot of community is going on these platforms, but I think many are probably very passionate about the job. But that doesn't mean that someone who's not exactly passionate is not a good fit. Like recently, I've also seen this comparison with I think it was even a short video, where they kind of pretended to interview a doctor and a software developer, and the doctor, or it was just the doctor and the interviewer, and the interviewer was like he was interviewing a software developer, and then like, oh, okay, but after work you still treat some patients on the streets and so on. And the doctor like, no, and this is basically what we do, right? In some sense, we finish work and then, but we're still more or less reachable. If Khalid pings me in the evening with some crazy thought, I stand up, sit down, and try something, or
Well, just to stick with that analogy though, if I was interviewing a doctor and I didn't see any patients that had survived, seeing this doctor, I think that would be a red flag, right? Especially if they're applying to be like head neurosurgeon.
But how do you see their patients?
Well, again, it's like
They're dead.
Not the whole work that they've done is public. So it is with software developers who worked on a project which is NDA. I mean, I get what you're saying. You probably want to look out for the more passionate ones. I mean, that's an interest of the company, but I think overall it shouldn't be a real requirement.
well, no, maybe I didn't say the word passionate, right? Like I understand people are in this industry because of multiple reasons. And I guess that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm saying that a public persona, a public presence of any kind is again a competitive advantage. Whether you do it on your free time or whether you convince your employer to do more open source stuff, like those are the challenges I think that are super important to make sure that you're also putting yourself in a position to get more opportunities, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So again, it's like an easy way to make sure you do things public is convince your current employer that you want a technical blog for your team, right? And that you're going to have hours allotted to writing technical content that will help the company advertise the tech that you're kind of doing, generally, or even like a technical thing that uses documentation for the team, but it's public somehow, right? I think those are good places to start. If your team is building your own framework, maybe consider open sourcing parts of it, and you can do that on company time. Like there's ways around this that don't involve you grinding till 3 a.m. in the morning.
That's true. Yeah.
I mean, that's what one thing actually, when I joined Software Park was, I think the first week I was told, take half a day or a day a week, just do what you want, just learn something if you want to learn it, continue developing something that you're already doing it with, but that is exactly what your point is. I don't have to work all day every day and then go on and do other stuff. I've got a day a week if I want it to learn something new or continue with something. And I think if you can convince the company to do that, win-win really.
And it's advantageous for them as well, right? For the company.
Well, it is, because then certainly in a sort of maybe agency type company, when new projects come along and say, oh well, we think this thing might solve it, has anyone got any experience with it? Well, you can say yeah, because I was tinkering with it on my half day or day, etc. So
yeah, and considering the fact that go ahead, sorry.
I have to interrupt for a moment. Does anyone else see the end broadcast button? Because I would like to drop out.
No.
Nope.
It's
just me. Okay, then what I would suggest, I hit end broadcast, because otherwise it won't end, I guess. But you can stay around. And,
no, we can just end it. There's always more to talk about. Plus, Jonathan's just gonna keep leaving comments on all my tweets anyway, so we'll be fine.
I've got to get my beauty sleep.
Okay, then sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so I mean, thanks everybody. I think this was fun, and hopefully we get to do it again sometime.
Yeah, it's good.
Next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah, sure.